All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Dad at Arms channel. I'm your host, Dad at Arms. I also go by Colt. And with me today, we have a very exciting guest. We have Griffin Newman, otherwise known as Orko.
I was going to say also go by Orko. Yeah.
Yeah.
At this point, either one, I guess, functions as my legal name.
Well, you've got a lot of names now. There's Griffin, there's Orko, there's Orko the Great, there's Oracle. We've got Oracle now.
There's Oracle. I feel like they haven't settled internally, and maybe I'm part of this or not, on is it Orko the Great? Is it Orko Reborn? Is it Orko the White? They're all used a little interchangeably for what this new form of Orko is called. But I like all of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And they all fit. And I think ultimately, I mean, the fans are gonna refer to these different names and these characters as they do. You know, I don't know if Oracle will stick because it's always Orko to fans, right?
Yeah.
It's good for like lore reasons, but
Orko's his previous name, or Oracle rather is his previous name. The question is, what's the new title? What's the new honorific for the new
after
Orko?
He's evolved, ascended?
I thought I perhaps mistakenly assumed, this will get settled when they put out the Masterverse figure of the new look, and they'll put the new title on the packaging, and that will be the one that's settled. Because on the scripts, they used one name. Powerhouse on their designs used a different name. But all of that is sort of internal stuff. That's never although obviously some of it is shared publicly. None of that's meant to be like definitive. It's sort of the way everyone working on the show uses these things for shorthand. And I was like, whatever Mattel stamps on the package with a trademark will obviously be the settled thing. And then the box came out and it just says Orko. So it's
Orko.
The debate rages on.
Yeah, I was talking with our friend Ted Biaselli just the other day about this. I was asking him about Tila's new title. Like, is she Tri-Sorceress? Because I think she says that in the show. She said, you know, when she's bringing back Preternia, she calls herself the Tri-Sorceress. I was like, so is that her new title? And Ted was like, you know, it could be. He's like, but what really matters is what they put on the box when the toy comes out.
It's the same thing. And I hadn't clocked this, but so many of the Masterverse, specifically the Revolution variant figures, now that we're getting into multiple looks of them, haven't had those sort of like modified titles. I didn't catch that, like, the Skeletech figure does just say Skeletor on the box. It always feels like, I think if you're a toy geek, you're like, whatever's on the packaging finally makes it the definitive title. That's the official title. But they've still been putting out these variant versions with the main name of the character. I feel like Tri-Sorceress is what's been used internally, but it's kind of interesting because, as I said, they'll write one thing in the script, and then when Powerhouse, who does the animation, does their sort of designs and turnarounds, and they post their turnarounds, so almost all of those are now visible to the internet, they'll often stamp a different thing on it. And then sometimes the fans start calling it a third thing. It's kind of cool that it gets to be a little bit of a dealer's choice, maybe.
Yeah. And that's kind of the fun part. And I think that goes back into the whole idea of what Masters of the Universe was, especially back in the beginning. It's like, no, here's the playground. The castle is a neutral zone. You fight for control of the castle. Whoever controls the castle is master of the universe. Right. You know, so we make up our own stories. And I think that DNA is still a little bit in how we refer to these toys and
I love you saying that because it's something I agree with wholeheartedly, and it's one of the things I find really interesting about Motu is that you have this thing that basically from its inception point you have multiple canons being created simultaneously that all bump against each other a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Like there's not this sort of key text in the same way there is with something like Marvel Comics or Star Wars, where you're like, well, the original text is the first movie, or it's the way Stan Lee created it, or whatever it is, you know? And then things start to diverge and you get multiverse or you get different interpretations. But Motu is this weird sort of backwards thing where you're like, well, there's a toy line being developed. And that's being sort of developed product first, but they're trying to kind of create a narrative around it. But then this sort of infamous story that I assume most of the people watching your channel know of, like when they're trying to go sell the toys, all the big toy buyers are like, well, how are kids going to know these characters if there's no cartoon show? And they go, oh, they're comics inside. The bluff they make up in the room, I think with the Toys R Us rep, they're like, we'll have mini comics in the toys that give the kids the narratives. But then they sort of outsource the mini comics. And so the mini comics are starting to be written in a way that diverges from what the toy guides had developed internally. And so there's its own narrative being created there. And then pretty shortly after, they do make the cartoon show. And they get Lou Scheimer and Filmation. And then they're starting to do a third thing. And they're not all wildly different from each other, but they divert in major ways. Mm-hmm. And even just like the fact that so many of the characters in the original line looked so different on the card back art than they did in the figure you're getting, that it does become this playground, I think, for kids who grew up with Motu, where you're picking and choosing, right? And to some degree, it's like, which thing were you exposed to first, or which thing did you have the strongest attachment to? And to other degrees, it's like, what was the internal canon you were making up in your head? And when you get into these debates that unfortunately sort of rile up whenever there's a new version of a thing like this, if that's not Motu, this is Motu, my response is always like, part of Motu is that there is no definitive answer, right? Mm-hmm. And that any version of it, even from the very beginning, is a version. Right. And I do think these series that I've been lucky to be a part of, Revelation and Revolution, are trying to tie together all these threads in interesting ways. But like, I don't think anyone who takes on Motu has the attitude at this point of like, I'm making the definitive canon. Right. Because there's never been a definitive canon.
It's impossible.
Right. And like, our show is trying to incorporate the 1987 movie and elements from the toy line and the mini comics and the Filmation cartoon, but also the 2000X cartoon, and also the DC comics and the classics bios and all these sorts of things. But when you make those choices, you're always going to have to pick one thing over the other, leave one thing out, modify it to best serve the story. And I love that about it, because I love things like what you're saying that exist as kind of sandboxes, not just for us as fans to create our own internal lore, but like anytime creatives come on to develop a new version of it, they get to experiment and try different things in the lab. Mm-hmm.
And it's fun because you get into these conversations, and like you said, a lot of times they go off the rails very quickly.
Sure.
But I always just kind of find it humorous when people say, "Oh, this ruined He-Man. This new version ruins He-Man. It's not sticking to the canon." It's like, well, what is the canon? Can you tell me what that canon is? Because it's all over the place.
I mean,
best. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I remember talking to a guy at PowerCon a couple of years ago, who his stance was, He-Man was at its peak when it was the original mini comic version of, the character that's now been retroactively named Ular, but like guy in a cave who is just kind of borderline Neanderthal,
right,
who is given the harness and the sword by the Green Goddess. Mm-hmm. And then becomes He-Man. And for him, the second Prince Adam was developed, the second any of that, the Kingdom of Eternity, all that stuff was developed. For him, it went off the rails. And I'm like, for that guy, the thing goes off the rails at the earliest possible point.
Immediately.
But I'm just like, that's totally valid. Like, that's the version of it he loves. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What were you going to say?
I was going to say is, I think the best way for me, I don't want to speak for others, but for me to enjoy Masters of the Universe is to look at these new iterations that come out and find joy in being able to point to all the different inspirations from the multiple versions. Yeah. I in my mind, I have certain marker points. I think I've called them anchor points before in other interviews that I like to see happen, and those are, Adam is heroic. Adam is kind.
Right.
Adam and Teela love each other. Skeletor is obsessed with power and fixated on beating He-Man, regardless of how idiotic the plan might be. These are kind of my internal headcanon markers, but I still like being able to point to these different things. So like with Filmation and Revolution, we see Teela's origin as the daughter of the sorceress. With the CGI cartoon that Rob David developed, we see kind of going back to this idea that she was a clone of the sorceress.
Right.
But it was also reinterpreted more to make her the reincarnation of Eldris.
Yeah.
So it's playing on these common ideas that we can all look at and say, okay, I recognize where this is coming from. I see where the inspiration points are from. And I don't see the purpose of getting angry about things.
Oh, I mean, I'm like, I understand. I'm zooming out here to a more abstract, larger conversation about sort of the state of fandom and all this stuff we like, right? Across many properties.
Everything, yeah.
Yeah. Because it's a thing I think about a lot and like talk about a lot with my friends. And I have to imagine you were the same way, where it's like you're growing up, you're a kid, you're a teenager, and you're sort of blue sky imagining, oh my God, how incredible would it be if they ever made a movie of this? If they ever brought this thing back, the stakes used to feel so high of we rarely get these things. And also, if they come out and they get them wrong, it's going to go on the shelf forever, right? There was this feeling of if someone makes their attempt at making a movie or a new version of blank and it bombs, it's going to be like put into movie jail, right? It's going to be frozen. Whereas now, like everything not only gets basically rebooted every couple of years, like clockwork, but also often we have multiple versions of one thing existing at the same time, where you can even pick which brand of ketchup do I like, right?
Right.
And I think the freedom of that is, in a way that I think is net positive, is every version of a property doesn't need to fulfill the pressures and expectations of everyone who has any relationship to a thing. Because if something like Motu has existed for 40 years plus now, and has existed in as many different variations as we're saying there is no agreed upon the fans like this, because you get into the people who only like the mini comics, or you get into the people who it's this part or it's that part or whatever it is, whatever your internal canon is. And so for me, it's like when a new version of a thing gets made, I want to see whoever the creative team is on that really try to find something new to express. I agree with you that what I'm looking for isn't a checklist of like every single detail is matching my favorite version of this thing. What I'm looking for, like, what are the sort of like big kind of spiritual touchstones of this thing? What are the definitive themes or the defining character traits, or what are the elements of the iconography that really feel important for me? And if they're checking off a couple of those boxes where I go, okay, they get it. They get the core of this thing, the soul of this thing. Then I go, great. I want to see where they riff from there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it just opens up the door. I don't know how to properly express it, but it allows us to be more open-minded about what we're being presented with.
Yeah.
And if we can set aside our preconceived expectations, we enjoy things more. And I think that's in general for a lot of things, not just cartoons we like and movies we like and video games we play. It's how we should approach life.
It's a good life philosophy. Yeah.
So, well, great. I love that we're getting into it right off the bat.
This is like a free therapy session.
Awesome. Use it as therapy. Yeah. When I was talking to Ted, he was like, I am so excited to talk about this stuff. I've had to keep my mouth shut for 2 years.
Yeah.
And now I get to talk about it. I was like, unload, man.
Let's Teddy, like, far deeper in the trenches and the guts of this thing than I am. But I was trying to like think back, and I do believe I first read these scripts 2 full years ago.
Yeah.
Even if you're just a lowly voice actor on a thing like this, the process is so long. I mean, animation is just so complicated and takes time to get right. That it is funny how sort of, there's the intensity of working on it. You get the scripts, you devour them, you think about it, you do a bunch of records, and then you're sort of on ice for like 2 years. And then you watch the episodes and you go, oh, right. And then you do this part of it where you have to talk about them. But there's this
so you're going back all this time trying to remember, be like, okay, how do I say this correctly so somebody doesn't go back and be like, oh, well, no, you said this, 2 years ago.
Sure. Yeah, a little bit, but no, but I mean, I read the scripts 2 years ago and then had to zip my mouth, you know?
Yeah.
I couldn't talk about all the stuff in there, which it's like, you know, I was one of the many people who was sitting on the Shatner's Keldor thing for a very long time, which was very exciting. The funny thing is, like, certain things, you know, I read in the script and they excited me and they surprised me and they thrilled me and whatever, and I remembered them very vividly. But you remember them in this way where you're like, well, I have the memory of reading them. I have the memory of the sort of mind's eye image of how I imagine it's going to look when I'm reading it. And I have the memory of the parts that I perform.
Mm-hmm.
And then 2 years later, you watch the episodes, and some of it is like, right, of course, this is the scene I've been waiting to see finally animated and hear what all the other voice actors did. And other things I totally forgot this was in there. And it's not that it changed. It's just like, you know, you can't hold 5 episodes in your head that you haven't actually seen for 2 full years. But yeah, it's exciting to finally get to watch them. And I've watched them fairly recently now. So now they're vivid again for me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, before we kind of get more into it, do you kind of want to, I guess, introduce yourself? Tell people how they know you?
Right into the deep end. Yeah. I'm Griffin Newman. I'm the voice of Orko across these 2 series on Revelation and Revolution. And my background is like as a comedian and actor. And now a podcaster. I have a podcast that I've done for the last 9 years with my friend David Sims, who's a film critic, called Blank Check, where we talk about directors' careers and we pick a director and go through all of their movies in order.
Awesome.
But I played Arthur on the most recent Amazon version of The Tick, another property that has been revived multiple times and has different canons and people who prefer one version over the other. But that was sort of my entry point into playing pre-existing characters that have had multiple versions before of little panicked, annoying flying guys and trying to jump into that history of a thing that I'd been a fan of for most of my life and try to figure out how to make my version of it. And in both of those cases, I mean, creatively, that process is very similar to what you described the process of watching it as a fan, right? Because in both of those cases, it was like, you know, I get these emails. There's an opportunity to you have a chance to compete for the possibility of playing these parts, which was a dream, even as a notion. And very quickly, that excitement goes to a tremendous sense of self-imposed pressure, right?
Yeah.
There's not just the pressure I think I feel anytime I'm auditioning for anything to get it right, but I'm also now applying the pressure of, well, I'm a fan of this thing. I have strong opinions. I'm thinking about the end result in a way that isn't just, well, let me do what feels right to me. It's like, no. Let me go back to my internal checklist. What are the core traits of this character? I don't want to do an impression of what people have done before, because if I'm going to do this, I have to try to find some way to make it my own. And that isn't redefine it. It's what's the version of it that I think I can do. That is, you know, what can I bring to it that no one else could? Doesn't mean I'm better or worse than any other performer, but it's like, what are the specific things I think I have a capacity to say here that, you know, expresses something different of the version of the character, whatever it is, right? I'm going into the weeds here in this theory, but in both cases, what I did was I just immediately obsessively dug back into the past of the thing and rewatching stuff and rereading comics and all of that and trying to find those, like, what are the defining traits? What are the things that are across every previous version of this character that are immovable? You know, whether it's a vocal quality, whether it's a spiritual quality, a characteristic, what are the things that if I'm watching a version of it and I see the actor get that part right, I, like you said, sit back, I relax, I go, okay, they get it, it's in safe hands. Now I'm ready to see what they want to do with it. And in either case, my goal is to reinvent the wheel. It's to try to sort of find my way into a new version of it, which this kind of silly metaphor I always use in my head is like, can you take the house that's already been built and add like an attic and a basement onto it.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want to change the core of what the thing is. You want to add some new rooms to explore that feel holistically part of the structure that's always been there.
I like that.
Yeah, and with Motu, with these series, it was very easy because they wrote so much stuff for Orko, the character that was so new that no previous actor had gotten to express, where I was like, well, I don't have to do this work trying to figure out what the new areas are for him. They're writing it narratively. Now I just have to figure out how to deliver that. I have to live up to the writing they're handing me.
Well, I think I can speak for everybody that I've talked to. I think you nailed it. And
I appreciate that deeply. Yeah.
And I think that's a good segue into what I want to talk about next. I'm going to bring my son in here. But real briefly, I don't want to embarrass him, but you know, when we watched Revelation 2 years ago, part 1 came out, you know, he watched it with me, and he was at a time in his life where confidence is kind of tough for kids sometimes, and didn't know who he was. He was having trouble fitting in at school and things like that. And to see him see your portrayal of this character who has always kind of been considered a sidekick, kind of a fool, and to see him come into his own, you know, even before he's brought back in part 2, but in part 1, he steps up and he faces down Scareglow, one of the most frightening villains there is in Motu canon, and protects his friends. And he does it because he makes a choice to be brave, and, you know, and to just see his response to that, and to see him really connect with that character, it did wonders for him. And it was a turning point for him. And we saw his confidence boost. He really leaned into that character. He wanted toys of Orko. He wanted t-shirts of Orko, you know. We eventually got him enrolled in some like Taekwondo classes and stuff like that, just to help him boost that feeling of self-confidence and self-worth.
Yeah.
And I just want, I get a little emotional talk about my kids, you know, but as a father,
you're dad at arms. It's your job to get emotional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's such an incredible thing to be able to see something that I have loved my entire life resonate with my children.
Yeah.
And to not only see it resonate with them because they think the toys are cool, but to see it improve their lives and to improve their sense of self-worth. And that's something that's priceless, you know. And we have people like you and people who, you know, write this show to thank for that. And so as a father, as a fan, as a person, I just wanted to tell you thank you for what you've done, because it's incredible.
It means a tremendous amount to me. It truly does. And it's sort of without being lofty or self-important, it is like basically what you just said is, I think, sort of the explicit dreamed goal all of us went into this with. Like everything you're saying is going back to an earlier part of the conversation. Those are sort of the tenets that I defined as like, these are the key attributes of this character that need to come across correctly. That is what gave this character meaning in all his previous versions. Mm-hmm. You know, the fact that he was created for Filmation first and foremost was, well, kids like playing with these toys. They like holding them in their hands and pretending that they're the big buff guy. But if you're telling stories in animation, there's no character on this show that sort of is an entry point to maybe how kids feel while they're watching it. Right. And Orko was created as that surrogate of, well, it's fun to imagine you're one of these muscle-bound guys or this guys with these magic powers and this technology and all this stuff. But Orko is not this buff figure. He's a little guy. He's trying hard. You know, he's really kind of the child of that universe. And I think the biggest thing for me always, and it goes back to the way Lou Scheimer played him, and I think with a tremendous amount of soul, and also the fact that he was the guy who created the character and was voicing him. I think you felt his admiration for the character, that it was a character he really cared about. But my big thing was always going back to the original cartoon, where I think some people would sometimes find him annoying. You know, there's some Motu fans who have always been like, Orko just kind of bugs. It's a little goofy, it's a little silly, he's a little annoying, and other people adore him. I think it has a lot to do with what age you were when you started watching, and you know, truly what size you were when you started watching, your level of confidence when you started watching, all these sorts of things. But my thing I really kind of picked up on in rewatching the old episodes is this sense of disappointment in his own voice when he would mess something up. There are a lot of sort of comic relief characters who are screw-ups, and the joke is that they're always going to get everything wrong, but when they do, they're sort of oblivious, or they cover it up with bravado, or whatever it is. And those moments where Orko's trick would go wrong, and Man-at-Arms would cross his arms and go, Orko! And you just hear it in Orko's voice. You'd see it in the animation, in his big eyes of just like, God, I really thought this one was going to work, you know? And he really wants to do right by his friends. And when I found out this new version of the show was happening, I got, frankly, pretty obsessive about getting this role. It was the hardest I've ever pursued any job in my life of any sort, because I felt a certain sense of protectiveness of I didn't want to see someone else get it wrong, which isn't to say that I thought I could do it better than anyone else, but I knew that I had identified in my head these things that were really important, kind of at the soul of the character, what we're sort of talking about. And if I, as a fan, watched the show 2 years later and someone was playing him just kind of silly as a goof and doing a funny voice, even if the voice was funny, I was going to feel frustrated that someone wasn't digging into what I perceived to be the deeper pathos of the character, right?
Right.
Now, I was thinking that, not knowing that they were going to write that into the script.
Okay.
I'm pursuing this part aggressively, going, what I would love to do as an actor and as an Orko fan is take whatever they've written and try to find a way to add a little more depth of feeling, of emotion, to bring that stuff to the forefront. But I might be trying to do that with a part that is written as just a series of silly gags and goofs. So I fought so hard for the part, and then I got the scripts and I went, oh my God, the whole arc is there. They've made it explicit, you know? And you have these scenes where Orko is explaining basically what I've always felt about him. Here's this guy who really just wants to do right by his friends, that has such a complex of, he joins them on these journeys and feels like he's the one who's messing things up. And he appreciates their loyalty to him, but he also punishes himself for not being able to rise to their level. And as you said, it's Arthur on the Tick shared this, but as a kid reading these comics, and you know, I'm still a little guy. I was even smaller when I was younger, and I dealt with tremendous anxiety and self-doubt and all these sorts of things, inferiority complexes, and you know, the bigger kids and not being good at sports and all this sort of stuff, and masking that with comedy and jokes and all this. But the thing I always loved about characters like Orko and Arthur is you're like, they're not even pretending that they're not scared. They're going into battle against crazy forces, surrounded by guys who even their allies, their partners, are much bigger and stronger and capable than them. And they're openly in the moment saying, I don't have a good feeling about this. I shouldn't be here. I'm terrified.
Right.
And yet they stay and they fight. And that's the thing that I've always found very heroic is like, you know, like He-Man is a hero, but a lot of Adam's self-doubt goes away once he is imbued with the power of, I'm now the strongest, most powerful man in the universe, right?
Yeah.
There is a core insecurity to Adam, but now he is given the glow up to like, this guy can do anything, right? And he can also do it almost with a distance of anonymity. He gets to like, have it be the separate public figure. Orko is never granted that, and yet he still stands there, or floats there, I should say, side by side with him. And even that moment of like him facing off against Scareglow, he's not been imbued with new powers at that moment, you know? The glow up doesn't happen until he becomes Orko Reborn or Orko the Great or Orko the White or whatever it is. That's just the moment of him choosing, I'm going to do this.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's very emotional to me. And it got me choked up reading it. And the hope was once it was identified, my feelings about this are the same as the people who are writing this. We're all in line on what we're trying to do here.
Mm-hmm.
The hope was to make a character that could speak to kids like your son in the way I think he spoke to some of us growing up.
Yes.
Yeah. So it means the world to me to hear.
Yeah. When you messaged me and said you were willing to do an interview, he was the first person I told, and I was like, hey, I get to do an interview with Orko. He just got that kid grin on his face,
Yeah. So. It's cool to hear. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah. All of it's about that. It's like that's what I'm trying to make, in my small part, contribute to making the version that I wanted to see when I was that age,
Yeah.
Awesome. And many other ages.
Sure.
Yeah.
Kind of going back to what you were talking about, about this idea of Orko making the choice to have his glow up. And
yeah,
I think that's something that always resonates with me in all of these things that I like. It's this idea that, being a hero is often about making the choice.
Yeah.
To be brave, to stand up, to say something.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is always going to resonate with me. And with He-Man, obviously he's this muscle-bound demigod, who can do amazing things, but at his heart, he's Adam.
Yes.
And I always kind of say, He-Man is what he can do.
Right.
But Adam is the hero that he is. He's the heart of what makes the champion the champion.
Yeah, I mean, it's no, sorry, go on.
Well, yeah, and that was just my thing. And so, he's easily compared to people like Superman,
Right.
But I guess for me, with my bias, obvious, I love Superman, but
yeah,
He-Man just feels special to me because it's this idea that regardless of what we can do with magic powers and things like that, what really makes people heroes is their willingness to do something, to be better.
Well, I think that the superhero that He-Man has more in common with is Captain America, because it's that similar, he's now in the perfect body. He now has all the power, but he's still making decisions from the mindset of the scrawny kid who gets picked on. Like that remains his spirit and who he really thinks as. With He-Man and Adam, there's more of an on-off switch, which keeps him really centered to that guy. But that's the thing we love, is it's like, a powerful person, a newly powerful person making decisions from a history of feeling powerless to some degree. Yeah. And it's you're right. It's like, we like to see cool, strong guys do cool stuff.
Sure.
But the heroic thing is, the decisions they're making, their morality, all these sorts of things. I mean, it's obviously, it was a decision that people had very strong feelings about. And mind you, it was not a decision I was part of. I'm just sort of reading these scripts once I'm hired. But the sort of killing off He-Man, I put in quotes, but it did happen in the beginning of Revelation. The thought there, from a storytelling perspective, wasn't, well, let's get rid of He-Man. Who needs him? Let's make a show about the other characters. It was, one, this property has always been called Masters of the Universe. Mm-hmm. Sure, some of the versions they put He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, on Filmation and things like that. But from its genesis, it's Masters of the Universe. This is about the collective. Mm-hmm. It is about this world and all these characters. And He-Man's kind of at the top of the pyramid. But it was like, if you pull He-Man out of the equation for a little bit, do you allow the supporting characters to grow or sort of find new versions of themselves in the way that, like, in real life, when we lose people, we find different aspects of ourselves. You know, in that absence, you suddenly start to be in conversations with things you couldn't really crystallize when things are there. And not that you take them for granted, but you take it as a given, right? Mm-hmm. So that was part one. And part two is you kill him off, but you bring him back in as Adam pretty quickly. And then you sort of do the same thing with Adam. Well, if Adam has now lost the power to be He-Man, and when people talk about, well, they kill He-Man off and he's barely on the show, sure, mm-hmm. but Adam's in most of that season.
Yes.
You know, and it's the same sort of character test of he's been sort of physically powerless. Then he was granted all this power, and now it's taken away again.
Mm-hmm.
How does that define him, and what is the journey he's going through to get him back to the point where when he regains the power, at one point he gains too much power and loses control, you know, like has to go through this journey to get back to. And I think a lot of storytelling is characters going through big events to end up back at something similar to a status quo. But in that journey, they've learned something new about themselves.
Right.
And the nature of all the previous He-Man shows, them being sort of more kid shows that were airing on broadcast television, one of the sort of double-edged swords of that is they want you to make the episodes easy to replay in any order, right? If you're doing the Filmation show in the 80s, it's nice if you build a little arc in there and you have storylines building over multiple episodes. But also, in 1985, whatever the local station is not going to pay that much attention to, well, this episode's supposed to come before this episode. They're going to rerun them in any order they want. So the stories have to be somewhat modular. 2000X was obviously much more serialized, but also that was just running a Cartoon Network at random hours, you know?
Mm-hmm.
They would premiere an episode at whatever time, but then it's just sort of in the soup. And the sort of modern phenomenon of we have DVD sets, the whole thing in the right order, leading to streaming, and the whole thing lives there in the right order. And stories can be sort of told in this intentional order, knowing that people will get to see it in the correct order, allows you to, and I think this is what everyone wanted to do when it came time to sort of develop Revelation, tell these sorts of stories where there are high highs and high lows that can span across multiple episodes, where you can go through this full rotation to get back to a sort of new normal. And I feel like Revolution is a series that's like, well, now we're living in the new normal.
Yes.
You know, which isn't to say it's a status quo series, because I still think there are crazy twists and arcs and everything. But it's like we've now kind of established what our version of Motu is. And it's now defined by the things that all these characters went through in the first season. And now there's kind of this classical He-Man versus Skeletor rivalry, redefined in a slight way.
Yeah. One thing I absolutely loved about Revelation was, you know, kind of what you were touching on. It always reminded me of the death of Superman story.
Yeah.
You know, you have the hero taken out early,
and
then this allows the world to kind of breathe and to assess what this hero actually meant to the world and to the people who were close to him. Obviously, we see this play out with Teela very intimately, as she struggles with these ideas of not being trusted by someone she loved, you know, not being respected for who she was, not being, you know, just kind of being a joke all along. But then we see her start to grow. You know, she starts to reconcile with characters. I think she reconciles with Cringer first, and Cringer tells her, no, you know, you do know Adam. Adam was your friend, and he trusted you because he knew that you would still be here when he was gone.
Yeah, I mean, and when, you know, people had complaints about her being unlikable or selfish.
Right.
I'm like, you know, people do some pretty unbecoming things in the stages of grief. There's a reason we define them as the stages of grief, and there's anger and there's bargaining and there's all this sort of stuff. I think if you asked Teela the character, she would not be proud of the way she acts in some of those
scenes. Absolutely not.
But I think it's emotionally realistic, you know?
Yes.
And it's not just that you go through those stages of grief, but she's also processing that a lot of her understanding of the world was different than it was. To not only realize that there was this kind of central lie happening around her, but that almost everyone she was closest to was in on it.
Yes.
That it's sort of like, you know, when someone dies and you find out this secret where you're just like, wait, and all of you knew? And I was the only one who didn't? And it's tough to sort of rewrite your relationship with someone in the wake of that. That's a story that can only be told if He-Man is dead for a little bit, right? And then when Adam comes back, there's a different story that can be told, and both of them sort of reckoning with that kind of thing. I mean, the death of Superman is a really interesting analogy, because I agree with you, like that opened up a lot of story possibilities after this character who has existed for, I don't know, 50 years at that point. And maybe they were starting to feel was like, what is there left to say about Superman? Well, if you take Superman out of the picture, there's a lot of new things to say about him in the absence of him. You start to become aware in the way that when you lose people in your real life, you start to clock, I never realized how important this was to me. You know, people talk about you lose a loved one, and the moments where it really hits you are, well, they would be the first person I called when I got this good news. And now that they're gone, I'm recognizing how important they were in that space, or in doing this, or having this aspect of my relationship. And sometimes there are more interesting stories, or just different stories, that can only be told if the characters are removed for a certain period of time. But like Death of Superman, it's like, well, they're going to come back.
They're coming back. Yeah.
They're coming back. It's, you know, I without being, when certain people got very outraged about it, my sort of response was to be like, I mean, come on, we've all been reading comic books and watching cartoon shows and seeing these movies forever.
We know the gimmick. We know
the gimmick. And that's not to say the death doesn't have some importance. I think in order for it to have some importance, you have to commit to it for a little bit. You have to really live in it rather than have it be a thing that's reversed within 10 minutes. That's part of the sort of storytelling gambit. We're going to remove something to be able to talk about the absence and then bring it back. And now everyone has sort of new relationships to it. I mean, the other version of this I equate it to a lot is Spider-Man 2, which for my money is still the best comic book superhero movie, and the original Spider-Man No More arc, where it's like you find out different things about Peter Parker the moment he stops being Spider-Man.
Right.
And in that moment, he starts to define why does the world need Spider-Man? You know, let's not take that as a given. Let's sort of interrogate it. And when he comes back as Spider-Man, he's made that choice. No, now I know why I'm here and why I'm doing it. It sort of re-energizes the whole thing. And so there was all this sort of dialogue of like, with Revelation when it came out, of like, was this a bait and switch? And did they sort of mislead us and everything? Part of that is, you don't want to ruin the story twist for people, you know? If you tell them up front, here's everything that's going to happen, then what's the fun of watching it?
Right.
You want to sort of live it in real time. You know, we got screwed a little bit, as, you know, and screwed on a smaller scale than the other things in the universe that got screwed by this. But the whole thing about the season being split in half was absolutely a byproduct of the pandemic and COVID really disrupting production timelines. It was the original intent. Those 10 scripts were written all at once. They were basically recorded together. And the notion was that all 10 were going to come out in whatever it was, June or July of 2021. And it was just impossible to get all 10 done at that point in time. By the time the first half of the season came out, the remaining 5 episodes were like 95% done. You know, I think some people like to think that the second half of the season was rewritten to fan response, which is like, that was basically locked. It was just, they couldn't get it 100% on all 10 by that date, but they could get 5 100% and have the next 5 pretty ready to go.
Well, and you might have, obviously you would have a better perspective on this, but one thing that I always thought of when that argument would be brought up, it's like, well, there's 4 months between July when part 1 dropped and November when part 2 dropped.
Yeah.
Is it really feasible to rewrite scripts Right. Bring actors in to re-record lines, reanimate scenes.
So long. It is so complicated.
This is impossible to do this.
It's impossible. And by the way, I mean, the moment everyone's goal was to release 10 episodes all at once, because I think, especially with the big story gambits of you're going to kill characters, it's going to make people upset, you're going to have to win them back, all this stuff. The hope was, well, if all 10 are out there at the same time, they can sit down and digest the story in one fell swoop.
Right.
And some of those decisions will make sense once you get to the end of it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it just became a necessity of, you know, and truly what I think it was really tied to was animation takes a long time, but toy production takes an incredibly long time. And that first wave of Masterverse figures was going to be on shelves. So it was sort of, do you push the whole season back to November to wait for all 10 episodes done, but then you're going to have Skelegod figures on shelves for months and months and months, when already I would argue maybe Skelegod was on shelves a little too early in terms of ruining that surprise.
Could have been wave 2, I think.
Yeah. And there was also the sort of moving pieces of there being the CGI reboot show.
Yes.
And they wanted this show to premiere before that show because this is sort of the more classical thing. And there was complicated release strategies far above my pay grade.
Yeah.
But there became this game time decision of like, well, 5 will be ready. And that's kind of a cliffhanger point. Let's put that out. But I think with distance, all of us wish that everyone could have seen the 10 all at once.
Yeah.
And now the 10 live there side by side on Netflix, and new people are going to come to them and watch them that way.
And I have seen people make the comment, you know, in different fan groups and stuff, be like, well, I finally sat down to watch Revelation and I watched all 10 episodes and I don't understand why this made people mad. Like I get it, you know?
Yeah.
And so it is, I think it's getting looked at more kindly in retrospect. And now with Revolution out, people are like, okay, this is a big picture type of thing. This makes more sense. And I think that's the benefit of having more to the story.
Totally.
You know, we're able to look back. And one thing in particular that I liked about Revolution is the flashback we see between Adam and Tila when they're, you know, they're training.
Yeah.
And then you hilariously interrupt them, which I thought was fantastic. And it goes back to what you're saying. You know, Orko is this childlike figure, you know, and that's headcanon, fan stories, things that I write, things like that. I'm like, of course, Orko would be that person to interrupt them and be like, yeah, that's an interesting wrestling move you guys are doing here.
That was kind of thing. My 2 favorite moments, just as an actor to get to play, is the basically the callback to that in the final episode. Where it's like, okay, Tila and Adam are finally going to like make the move. And then Orko comes back in and sort of has this attitude of like, thank God everyone else left, right? Now it's just the 3 of us. Like, you know, everyone else was stopping the 3-person hangout that he felt was the tension of the scene.
Yes.
Rather than the 2 of them finally kissing. I love that. And then the other moment I obviously love is the Orko being handed the sword and doing the psych out with everyone.
Yeah. And I liked that because there's in the DC comics, the Attorney Ward, there's that one shot of Orko where he does get the power and he becomes Ore-Man.
Yes.
Which is so fun. You know, it's fun to see these things, you know.
But I think getting back to like the spirit of Orko as a character, I think they were very wise to as much as it would be fun to see Ore-Man, and I, you know, as a biased person would love to see Ore-Man and get a figure of him and all of that.
Of course.
The integrity of the character is he would make that joke, but he wouldn't actually do it because it would be irresponsible, right?
And he knows.
And it was key to me in sort of playing that scene as a voice actor, that when he does it as a bit and then sees how much everyone else freaks out, it's not just I'm just kidding. You know, it's a like, oh no, I'm sorry, I kind of have to apologize energy.
Right.
I'm sorry for giving you a shock.
That was a bad joke. I didn't think that through enough.
Right. That he's genuinely a little bit freaked out by realizing that everyone took that seriously. Yeah.
You know, but that flashback scene, I think that really does a lot to help people better understand where Tila is coming from for her reaction in episode 1 and kind of her bitterness. We see clearly that these two are in love.
Yeah.
And this flashback takes place the day before he dies. You know, so to go from that moment to her learning the truth of who he is, watching him die at the same time, realizing that she's been lied to not only by the man she loves, but also her family and friends.
Yes.
You know, that's a lot on top of the grief.
By her dad and her best friend, who also is this like unrequited love figure, you know?
Yeah.
She's dealing with the death of a thing where it's like, how much was unspoken between the two of us? Not just the secret part of his life that I didn't know, but like, we never actually verbalized the emotions that I know I felt, and now I'll never know if he felt in the same way. That's
and
like
so she's losing her. Yeah, she's losing her hopes and dreams. It's all crashing down around her.
And despite what some people might think, that was always sort of the larger story intent. You know, there wasn't the guarantee that there would be a second season, but the sort of internal canon of what everyone was working towards because there was a sort of larger story planned out, and like, thankfully, you know, the show performed well enough for Netflix that we got to tell this second part. And there's a very clear plan for what the third part would be that I think is really exciting and speaks to that sort of larger big picture thinking that was in place from the moment this whole thing was conceptualized. But sort of letting the will they, won't they of Adam and Tila, what is this relationship, you know? Really come to the fore was always part of the story. It was never designed to be Tila replaces Adam, and by the way, she never liked him and she's going to get married to Andra. And that season 2 is not everyone suddenly panicking and changing course to make it that. That was always sort of the hope of, can we get to this stage of the story? I say all of this, you know, not being someone who wrote this, but being someone who's just been keyed into the storytelling is all of this. And especially because, you know, I'm not alone in the voice cast on this, but being such a big fan, I ask a billion questions that are above my pay grade because I, as a nerd, just want the scoop of like, so what are you thinking about this? Was this meant to be this? And where is this going? So I've dug in and tried to hold on to the secrets for a long time of what was everyone's thought process in how this was set up and where they were hoping it would go.
Yeah. And I love that. And I think, you know, as a fan watching that was something that I was able to see. Like you see these themes that are being played out. You hear it in the dialogue. You know, there's a moment between Tila and Evelyn where Evelyn says, you know, I'm not the only one still carrying a torch. You know, it's very specific moments where like we understand what's going on. And so to see the reactions, one, I think they're exaggerated for, you know, to fuel the algorithm of rage for content creators. Two, I think it's just a really immature way to process media.
I mean, let me be clear. There are people who have their problems with the show, and I have read their explanations or watched their videos or listened to podcasts or whatever. You know, this is a double-edged sword of, you know, it's the adage of don't read the comments, right? If you're the one making the stuff, it's always inevitably going to get to stuff that hurts your feelings or makes you frustrated. At any scale of what you're doing, you're always going to have that. You know, the double-edged sword of me being such a big fan of Motu for such a long time is the corners of the internet where people were complaining about this show are the corners I was already spending time on. You know, so suddenly
oh man,
the message boards where I've anonymously been for 15 years, or some of the channels I watch or accounts I follow, I'm reading that. I'm reading people who have positive responses like you and many others, but I'm reading too much of the bad stuff, arguably, as well, right? And there is stuff that I felt was in bad faith, that felt like it was kind of explicitly trying to drum up outrage. But I read a tremendous amount of people very thoughtfully explain their problems with it as a story in a way that I thought was beyond valid. Because going back to what we were saying at the beginning, it's like, if you're going to make big story choices with a thing that's existed for this long, that people have various different relationships with different versions at different points in their life and whatever, people are going to have strong reactions. It's never going to be exactly every single person's version of Motu in their mind and in their hearts, which I get. I'm not like anyone who dislikes the show is a troll and is operating in bad faith.
Right.
I think that's very far from the truth. The frustrating part is sort of separating the two, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I do think in sort of conceptualizing Revolution, as much as there was a larger game plan of where they hoped the second part would go, the story they would get to tell if Revelation was successful enough and that was stuck to, there was definitely some consideration to like, okay, let's look at the people who are explaining things they found frustrating or disappointing in season 1, and how can we speak to those? The things that feel like reasonably worded criticisms,
Yes. Yeah.
You don't want to make a season that is reactionary to the most extreme response, not just because, I think I don't want to maybe call out other examples and slam them for this, but there's certain installments of stories that I love, that I watch, and I'm like, you can feel that the writers, the directors, whoever, are all panicked about the fans on this one. And they're desperately just trying to do, we think this is what you want. And when that happens, I feel like it's the worst of all outcomes. I'd sort of always rather someone very confidently take a big swing, even if I personally don't like it, than watch someone desperately try to please me. Because
you can respect the integrity behind what they're trying to do.
And I think when you're operating from that place of desperation, it ends up not really pleasing anyone, But there were notes of just like, oh, okay, so like here's the story we were always planning on telling. And I think, the focus of part 2 was always going to be this sort of shifting to, you've really in Revelation dug into Teela's destiny, right? What is this thing that has been sort of hanging over her from the very beginning, from the earliest stages of filmation, the creation of the character, the mini comics, as you said, this notion of what is her relationship to to the sorceress, and what is her destiny and all of that. And that was sort of the main journey that felt like this is a really great unfulfilled story. It has always been there. It has been in the roots of Motu, and it's never really gotten a chance to fully bloom. And that's the thing we're going to kind of build our season around. Season 2, I think the big notion was, can you tell the same kind of story with He-Man and Skeletor? Because there's a similar destiny that's hung over both of them. Skeletor always feeling like he was robbed of his chance to sit in the throne. And Adam's destiny as a prince, not as He-Man, but as the prince and the son of Randor, he someday is going to need to be the king of Eternos, which is very different than being He-Man, which is very different than being the protector.
Yeah, and how interesting of a story is that now that Adam is known to be He-Man. He doesn't have to pretend to be this coward anymore.
Correct.
And he can finally kind of have the respect that he's always deserved.
Yeah.
And now he has to consider, well, shoot, now do I have to stop being He-Man when I was just finally getting to enjoy it?
Yeah, and I think it's a thing that, Kevin and Tim Sheridan and Teddy and all the people who work on the show, Rob David, Eric and Dia, and so many great people who are on the staff of the show. But I think a big thing they've done with both seasons is look into these things of, I don't even want to call them plot holes, but in some cases, they're spaces that exist because of the competing different versions of the property that have existed for 40 years, as we've been saying. And in some cases, they're just kind of like, that's sort of like an interesting thing that's right there in the story, that's been there the whole time, that's never really been explored or called out. And I do think there's something interesting to Adam gets the power of Grayskull, not Randor. Randor at no point has ever gotten that power. Right. And especially in Revelation, when we meet, the series version of King Grayskull, but also Wundar and Hero and all these sort of precursors. It's like, well, at different times in the legacy, the king, the ruler of Eternos, and the man imbued with the power of Grayskull is one and the same. They are one figure, right?
Right.
They are both the sort of political leader and the superhero champion defender.
Yes.
And that didn't happen in this generation. It got bifurcated. You know, Randor gets to be the politician. He-Man gets to be, Adam gets to be the protector. Yeah. And if push comes to shove and you remove Randor from the story, then what happens there? Does Adam actually want to be king? You know? And Skeletor, a man who was driven mad by his inability, by his lack of opportunity to ever get this thing that he felt he was entitled to. It's another story where you just go, you remove Randor from the equation, emotions are going to be high with all the characters, but also suddenly everyone's sense of self is redefined.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love it. I love having He-Man with us again, you know?
Yeah, and I love, you know, like, mirroring that, now that we've had the season 1 journey of Teela getting to the place of accepting her destiny as the sorceress, season 2, Revolution, is now her coming to... It's funny. I mean, it almost goes back to what I was saying about, like, the challenge I feel as an actor trying to take on these characters that have existed previously of, like, okay, but how do I make my version of being a sorceress? You know?
Yeah.
I don't want to just do what my mom did. I don't want to just do an impression of her, you know? And so you have this great sort of subplot in season 2 that is her experimenting with, like, well, what does it mean to be a sorceress? And what are the other powers that we've tapped into? And other people have been scared of doing this and just doing this. What if I try to do a little bit of everything? This sort of ultimate journey to getting to the Tri-Sorceress, which is her trying to find her own way of occupying this role.
Yeah.
It's also just like, it's not to be overly simplistic about it, but it's cool to see. Like, that is an example of one of the things I forgot from reading the script, you know, where when I was watching the episodes, I was like, oh, right, she gets to turn green and she's using the snake armor.
She's got that snake armor.
And they found a way to, like, tie all this stuff back in. That's just such a cool, like, fanboy moment.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, snake armor on Teela is my favorite look for Teela.
Yeah.
You know, going all the way back to the toys.
Yeah.
He-Man in his battle armor is my favorite version of He-Man.
Yeah, and one of those things where you're like, that's crazy.
It's just fun.
Right, and you're also like, right, that has never been an animation before.
Yeah.
It almost feels wrong where you, like, have the false memory of, like, I must have seen that before. To realize, no, like, 45 years in, this is the first time.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
And just, you know, just this idea of generational expectations, you know, speaking again as a father, I want my children to be better than I was, you know? And I think that's what's going on in this story. We see Teela trying to find her way as the new sorceress, and her mother is encouraging her, no, now you have this opportunity. You're not bound to the castle.
Yeah.
You can be better. You can do more than I ever could. You know, and you have Randor talking with Adam, being like, you know, you have this heart that is full of love, you know. I want to see you happy. I want to see you share it with your children and with Teela, and, you know, I want you to be happy. Find your joy, you know, be better. You know,
there is a reason, you know, humans have told so many stories on these themes for so long, because it is just like the most human, deeply relatable thing to sort of tell stories about. Is all of us are defined by our relationships to our parents, or lack thereof, you know. Right. Either the presence or absence of your parents, and the feeling of, how do I live up to them, or am I doomed to become them, you know?
Right.
It is the most human trait. Everyone is living through some version of that on some scale.
Absolutely.
And it's why Star Wars, like, exists and stays relevant, is like the core thing that George Lucas tapped into. And when you read about how Star Wars, like, generated as an idea, which I've spent too much time studying, you know, the core of Star Wars is that, like, George Lucas's dad owned a hardware shop, and the expectation upon him was, you will take over my hardware shop. Your destiny is, this is the business I started, and you have to inherit it. And George Lucas didn't want to run a hardware shop. His dad wasn't Darth Vader. He wasn't a war criminal.
Right.
But what he was tapping into was that feeling of, I am told that this is what my life is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I step outside and I stare at the sunset and I wonder if there's something more out there for me. And George Lucas finally found his thing. He found film, and he found this expression of, oh, this is who I was meant to be. And I don't have to become my dad. I don't have to sell screws for a living. He amplified it to this absurd degree, but it's like the core emotion of that is so deeply human and relatable. And I think that's always been this thing that's like in the core of Motu. And it's across so many characters. And even like it's a change from previous canon. But the Oracle thing I loved so much in season 1 because I find, and I'm not just saying this because it is the version I got to play. I was excited when I read that in the script because I've never personally loved the sort of backstory in Filmation that would get brought up sometimes of like, well, I was really powerful on Trollan, and when I came here, my powers are weakened, and that's why I'm bad at everything I do. Because it always just felt a little too convenient and neat to me.
Yeah.
To make it because it's going back to the core of what we were talking about and what your son and many others and myself as a child connected to so strongly of he's not powerful and he's trying really hard. And it always felt like this sort of like, lie a high schooler tells to be like, well, but you don't see me on the weekends. I'm really powerful. At my home planet, at my old school, I was really popular,
I have a girlfriend in Canada, guys.
Right, which even Driel is like kind of like that. I know Driel comes and visits, but like it really did feel like that to me. And the Oracle backstory, it's sort of like, well, he was sort of bluffing to everyone about all of this, but it puts this sort of emotional weight on him of, well, Adam and Tila felt these pressures placed upon them, their destinies, their parents, what they had to become. But they are powerful people. They only become more powerful. Right. Orko had all of these expectations placed upon him and could never live up to them. Just failed conclusively to the point where they mocked him, and became a joke. And he basically transferred to a new high school and reinvented himself, and tried to like set up this kind of narrative and still tried and still failed, but in a place where there was less of a burden of expectation placed upon him. And, I talked about this with Teddy Biaselli, but like it was when Orko is reborn at the end of Revelation, there were only a couple of lines of dialogue. I really think it was maybe only 2 or 3 I had to do when he's reborn, because so much of what he does in that final episode is just kick ass, excuse my language, but that requires a lot less of me as a voice actor. That's just powerhouse, wilding out and doing cool stuff. My job at that point is just to go do all the noises, but I don't have to sell that as much as in dialogue. He announces himself when he's reborn. Lynn, when you raised hell, you brought something back with you, and you guys are in trouble now. I feel like were the 2 big lines I had to say, and I found them very difficult because it was like, well, how do you make an Orko that is more empowered now? Yeah, that doesn't feel unrecognizable from who the character was, because the core of him has always been to me him trying in spite of failure, and it's like, you don't want him to be cocky. You don't want him to just suddenly be a badass, And what I talked about with Teddy was like where I ultimately landed from a lot of trial and error. And I in fact, honestly practiced this a lot in the downtime between the 2 seasons. Even before I knew that season 2 was definitely happening, of just like, let me work on this so I'm ready to go should season 2 happen. And I end up having to do a lot more dialogue as Orko the White, which I now have. And the calculation ended up feeling like he can't be more confident, but you can remove doubt, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I didn't want him to be cocky. I didn't want it to be the kind of nerd glow up, and now he's awesome. And because then at that point, I think he does kind of get reduced to a joke, right?
Sure.
I mean, I think that kind of cockiness is not what I'm good at playing as an actor. If you want Orko to just be the Terminator now, maybe cast a different guy. But I also don't think that's what they wrote. And so it was like, you can have him still be sensitive and vulnerable in a certain way, but you can remove some of the doubt from the equation, you know? Right. He may be just the most confident Orko ever gets is level.
Well, I think, I think that's a great way to describe it, not add in this element of cockiness, but remove the self-doubt.
Yeah. That's what it was for me, because now he knows that he's more capable.
Yeah.
But emotionally, he's still the same guy. He has the same concern about doing right by his friends.
Mm-hmm.
He's just less afraid that his trick is going to go horribly. His spell will mess up everything.
Right. And I am glad that he's able to retain that childlike innocence.
That was huge.
Of who he is.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's just perfectly portrayed in his interactions with Adam and Tila in those, more romantic moments of him not getting the hint.
Just doesn't get it. But then the other side of that, the real gift of this season for me was the introduction of Gwildor, which it gets to reveal an entirely different side of Orko. This is the only guy he's going to be a jerk to, right?
Yes.
Like, he appeals to Lynn with compassion,
Right.
When Orko faces bad guys, he tries to find the good in them.
Mm-hmm.
When Orko faces Gwildor, this is the one guy who is direct competition to him. And so to Gwildor, he's going to throw haymakers, He's going to throw shade, which I love.
And just from a fan perspective, seeing Gwildor and Orko on screen, I mean, we all know that Gwildor was...
He replaced him.
He replaced Orko for the movie, We all understand that. And so to see them together, to see them interacting, and like you said, who gets the spot on the team,
Right.
And them fight it.
I had someone ask me, what's the backstory for why you think Orko has this grudge against Gwildor? And I'm like, the backstory is what we know. The backstory is the 87 movie happened and he wasn't invited.
Yeah.
He still can't get over the fact that they had this awesome mission on a different planet that he hears them talk about. Still, they reference it. Right. And it wasn't like he got replaced by Ram Man.
Right.
It's like, well, that guy's got a different specialty. You bring him along on this mission because he does something I can't do.
We don't need Orko's gimmick. We need Gwildor's gimmick for this.
Right.
So Orko,
and you're like, those are basically the same gimmick, but these two guys basically have different theologies, which is they accomplish the same thing, but Gwildor's doing it through technology and Orko's doing it magic. Mm-hmm. And because they have those different philosophies, but are fighting for the same spot, they can really sort of take things out on each other. Because it's like, I don't just think I'm better than you. I think your entire raison d'etre is wrong.
Yeah. So with the acting process, when you act these scenes, do you get to be in the room with the other actor?
Totally alone. Alone. I was because there were some promo videos that came out for season 1 for Revelation that showed Mark Hamill and Lena Headey getting to work together. Yeah. And there was one session that the two of them did together for a handful of the scenes in Revelation. And that was the only time across these now 15 episodes that any two actors have been in the same room together.
Wow.
And that's basically par for the course with animation. You very rarely get to record with someone else. Okay. There are a few shows. I know Simpsons did it for a very long time. And Bob's Burgers, I think, often does it. They tend to be more comedy shows, and it is, it honestly makes production more complicated. It makes animation more complicated. It makes editing more complicated. But more often they choose to do it with comedy because you go, well, there's something in the timing and the rhythm that's harder to replicate if you're not in the same room. So better to get the funny here and make everything else more difficult later. But most animated projects, be it movies or TV, comedy, action, what have you, you record everyone separately because the weirdness of voice acting is you're sort of like my new metaphor I've come up with recently that I now keep repeating while doing all these interviews for the new season is it's like you're making like bespoke puzzle pieces, but without a total awareness of what the entire puzzle needs to look like.
Okay.
And so you're crafting alternate puzzle pieces. Well, what if there's one where there's a thing coming up here and there's a hole in here? Let me do one where it's the opposite, you know? And so you give people a bunch of options. You got to figure out what your character is and your take is and all of that. But then you get in there and you do, what's the version of this line where Orko's angry? What's the version where he's embarrassed? What's the version where he's this, you know? Because in some cases, it's only when you animate it together and you get everyone else's voice records that you go, oh, actually, we didn't think of it this way. But if he plays it this way and she plays it this way and the drawing looks like this, that is a new discovery.
Right.
So especially a thing like Orko and Gwildor, that's so much really like a comedy dynamic. It's back and forth. It's sort of like funny bickering. That's all done in post. It helped that from doing the first season, from doing Revelation rather, Teddy and I had gotten to know each other and had become friendly. And know that we're both mega fans of this thing. And that when I was told that Gwildor was going to be on the season and that it was going to be played by Teddy, I immediately understood what it meant to have Gwildor as a character faced with Orko, right? I'm like, awesome. I get how that needs to sound. Yeah. These two guys fighting in these two voices. And I also knew that now, he is primarily an executive and, is more of a producer and a writer at Netflix. But Teddy was like a professional voice actor for like 10 plus years. He moved to LA in the first place to do that. I mean, he's had this wild circuitous journey. I know you've interviewed him as well, but like started out as an animator, then became a voice actor, and then sort of became more on the development writing side of animation. But I knew how good of a mimic he was. Yeah, I knew how good he was at voices. I knew both some of his work that he had done, but also from hanging out with him, hearing him at times do impressions of other characters, where I went, well, I know what Teddy's going to do. Teddy is going to be obsessed with making Gwildor sound exactly like the Billy Barty version we all remember, right? And I trust that he's going to be able to pull that off. So the weird part of it is you're sort of doing this dance routine with another person in the dark, not being able to see their dance moves and having to guess, I think this is kind of what he's going to do and how I should match it. And it's very exciting to watch the final product and cutting it together and seeing the animation and it feeling like it all works. Yeah. But even as a part of it, you're just like, I can't believe this works. Yeah, it totally has the energy of us being in the same room.
Right. And that's what I was going to say, because the chemistry is obviously there.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is just, Teddy and I at this point kind of knowing each other's moves, being able to project what we think the other guy's going to do, and being familiar enough with the characters and having similar interpretation on those two characters that it was like we both were working towards the same goal. And by the way, look, when in voiceover, if you do try something that ends up being the wrong thing and the chemistry isn't right, 6 months later they call you in and go, you got to redo it. If it isn't working, they find a way to fix it. Yes. And often that happens when you cut it together, you put it to storyboards, and then you go, we thought it was going to play like this, and it does not, and we got lucky that none of that stuff had to be re-recorded. A lot of season one did overall. I think a lot of it was just sort of moving pieces. And I think Revolution really was a much smoother process, not just because thankfully there wasn't a lockdown and there wasn't this sort of disruption of process, but in production. But I also think everything just kind of fit together on the first try more this time.
Very cool. Very cool. So over the course of, Revelation and Revolution, you've been able to take the character of Orko to some fantastic places. Yeah. I think with Revelation, the standout part of his story is his relationship with Evil Lynn and how surprising that was to myself, and I'm sure other fans seeing these two
to me
have such a deep connection and understand each other.
It's not an obvious pairing.
Right.
And it was not obvious what you could sort of plumb out of emotionally putting those two together.
Mm-hmm.
And that was another case of like, I watched the show and I'm like, God, Lena Headey and I have such good chemistry. And I'm like, I've never met her. I've still never met her in any capacity. I'm like, we work well together. And it's an absolute like sort of mirage. But I think it just speaks to if her interpretation of the character works and my interpretation of the character works and Powerhouse is animating both characters correctly, the writers hit upon something interesting, this sort of weird water and oil, this sort of anti-chemistry they could have.
It's really neat.
Yeah.
I remember seeing like the memes and stuff that came out. There's that one of it's this friendship with Skeletor ended. My new best friend is Orko.
Yeah.
Kind of, it's just like this is the stuff you love to see as a fan,
Yeah.
These kind of responses to what's being put out there.
Yeah.
Just fantastic, man.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, I don't even know if I've said this to any of the team on the shows, and this is me just trying to verbalize will into the universe what I want.
Yeah.
I'm realizing now that I should also probably text Teddy and pitch this to him rather than just saying it on the stream. I should text Kevin and go, hear me out. But I think season 1, you have, this whole arc of Orko with this scene partner that you wouldn't really think he'd have a connection to, a common ground. And then season 2 is, well, a guy you imagine he'd have a lot of tension with, but a character you never thought I never thought as a fan they will ever let them occupy the same space at the same time.
Right.
So it makes a lot of logical sense, but even then it was just surprising that it finally happened. I would love to, in season 3, get to some of the other Trollans. That's the thing I, as a fan, would love to see. Like, now that we've explored his dynamics with some of the other characters, I'd love to get Driel on there. I'd love to get Montork in there. I know what the basic arc is of the hypothetical 3rd season, and it rules. But it doesn't sound like I think there's space to figure out what Orko does in there, and my pitch will continue to be bring Driel back in there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I would love to see Driel.
Yeah, I would too.
She's cute.
Yeah.
I keep joking with Teddy that if they do a season 3, that I guess I could rearrange my schedule to come in and voice act the officiator for Adam and Tila's wedding.
Good.
Like, you know I'm the biggest fan, Teddy, so it's got to be me.
He'd be officiator.
Yes.
Would be his name with the dash in between. Yes.
Big muscles.
Exactly. Yeah.
This would be great.
Yeah.
No, it's just funny. Teddy's fantastic. I really respect and love him, and he's a person that it shows how much love he has for this, not just Revolution, but the franchise, the brand, in general. He's been a fan his entire life, and
I mean, he always says it's my number one. It's not just I'm a fan of this, but this has always been my number one thing. And all of us who I think are fans have a number of things we're fans of, but there's always kind of like, what's your key thing?
There's always that one.
Right. Yeah. And Motu, I think, just because it's been so on and off over decades, isn't a lot of people's number ones,
Yeah.
It's like, I loved it when I was little, and then I've been really excited whenever it comes back. But there have always been lean years of Motu where it's like, now there's like almost a decade where there's not a ton happening, and it's hard to keep that flame aloft. And Teddy has just been like, this always is my number one thing every day. Yeah.
And I remember like in college and stuff, always been a fan of it. And then anytime you'd see any reference to Masters of the Universe, it just created this so much excitement,
Totally, because it wasn't out there on a regular basis in the same way as like even Transformers and G.I. Joe and some of the other 80s properties that were like kept afloat, even if they changed and the version that was still out there was different. You were like, there is a continuum of those surviving and just staying above water, whereas Motu will like go like this and it will dip out for stretches of time. So you're holding on to any little morsel of like
just anything.
I've been rewatching 30 Rock, and there's like I know there's an episode. I can't remember if there are other references, but there's certainly an episode where Judah Friedlander's character has a Skeletor action figure and calls it out by name. And I was just like, right, when that was like airing in 2010, I must have been amped that Skeletor was being acknowledged anywhere.
Exactly.
You know? Yeah.
And I think that's just kind of how it's such a niche brand
in a lot of ways. Yeah.
You know, instantly recognizable, but it still just doesn't have that power that like DC Comics or Marvel has or Star Wars has.
No, you know, what's helped
in that kind of sense.
What's helped it now is, even though it's been on and off, it's been on and off across 4 decades. So you now have the generational accumulation of people who got in at different points.
Yeah.
And people who have different relationships to it, where I finally feel like the niche has become big enough that it can support new versions, 2 new TV shows, and hopefully this live action movie finally coming to fruition, all this sort of stuff. It feels like it's finally hit a sort of breakthrough point for the first time really since its original days in the 80s, where it's like it maybe feels like it's at a low simmer and evergreen that is going to stick around.
Yes.
Yeah.
As important as this has been in my life, I just really feel like we're in this really neat resurgence of everything. Like you said, we've got the 2 shows, we've got hopefully the movie, we've got new comics, new toys coming out. I've told this story before, but it's just such a special thing that even 17 years ago, when my wife and I got married, I made the joke to her, that we should take my He-Man and Teela figures off the shelf and use them as our cake toppers.
Yeah.
And she loved it. She loved that idea. So our wedding pictures have He-Man and Teela in them on top of our wedding cake, So it's always been this thing that's just been so special to me. And now finally, as a kid, seeing these things as I'm watching this cartoon and wanting things to happen, like, I've always wanted to see Adam and Teela get together, He-Man and Teela be together, and then to finally see it so many years later as an adult, it just fills me with so much joy. And watching that moment, I talked to Ted, so I knew there was a kiss coming, but just seeing it build up and seeing how they do it, it's just, my jaw was on the floor. Seeing
those forms of them finally doing it, like the moment it finally happens, it's like we're seeing an Adam we've never seen before, a Teela we've never seen before. They've evolved into such interesting versions of themselves. No, I agree. I mean, there's this storytelling principle that I believe in very strongly, of like, you want things to be surprising yet inevitable, right?
Yes.
If you're telling a story in a way that is too rote, too by the numbers, it's boring. Even if it's checking off everything you as a fan want to see happen, or even removing the fan from it. You're someone who likes a certain genre. You go to see a rom-com. Well, if you paid your $15 at the movie theater, or you've made your rental, you've queued it up on Netflix, you want to see them get together at the end. That's part of the contract you've signed. I want this, I want that, I want funny sidekicks, best friends who have good one-liners. There's certain agreements in any type of story that you have to sort of make with the audience. And if you do it in a way that's too rote and by the numbers, it becomes boring, even if you're fulfilling everything the person wants to see. The flip side of this is, if you withhold the things they want to see, you twist them and you make it surprising just for the sake of shocking people,
right,
or getting ahead of them, or trying to do the thing they couldn't anticipate, you're going to leave them frustrated, And it's the type of thing that I think made certain people feel frustrated with Revelation as a season, especially when it was split in half like that. What you want to do is get to the things that feel inevitable, like Adam and Teela getting together, but get there in a way that is surprising.
Right.
To go through a journey to earn that point that is surprising, and where at points along the way you go, maybe they're messing this up, maybe this isn't going to work, this isn't how I imagined it, but sort of do it all very consciously and carefully to get to a point where, it's all about, like, there was a friend of mine who had a criticism of Revelation that I thought was actually really interesting. And I think it is a thing the main creative team on the show took to heart. This kind of sentiment going into Revolution was, at the time Revelation was premiering, this is the first piece of He-Man animation since 2000X ended. Mm-hmm. It's been a while, right? Yes. We've all been waiting to see these characters again. And Revelation starts out with one episode that is kind of everyone how you remembered them, trying to pull together multiple mythologies. It's not directly just a sequel to Filmation. It's kind of a sequel to the history of the property, right? Mm-hmm. But here are kind of the characters presented in this classical sense. And then this very shocking thing happens. And within the next episode, now the world is a little unrecognizable. And characters' looks have changed, and their energies have changed, and their attitudes have changed. And, we were saying things like Death of Superman, that's happening in response to what had been happening in the Superman comics for decades up until that point.
Right.
Something like Spider-Man 2 is doing that after we've seen a movie of Spider-Man being Spider-Man. We've seen the classical origin story. We've seen him come into his power. We've seen him beat Green Goblin. Everyone is like, "Whew, what a relief. They got Spider-Man right." And now you can do the story that twists it a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the sort of internal pitch on Revelation was, make the story that is the sequel to the history. And I think some people watched it, and this is fair, 100%, and went, I'm only getting one episode of all the characters the way I remembered them. And It's been so long since I've seen them that I would love to live in this for longer. Right? If you're going to upend things, give me more episodes of things being normal before things start to go wacky. And it's because I think people would have loved to see a full powerhouse season with this cast of sort of classic Eternia before the things shift, or just more episodes of it or whatever it is. But I do think Revolution has gotten to a point where there is a new normal, and there's a status quo, and there's a settling into this version of the world that in some ways totally resembles the classic things, and in some ways it's new elements have been added on or twisted or whatever. But I do think there's that sort of fun of this being now you're in this world, and now we've set up our own sandbox, you know? It's not just building something new in the sandbox of the history of the property. Now it's here's the new He-Man Netflix sandbox, our internal canon we've built, and now we can tell stories that are building off of our own stories rather than building off of the history, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I do think that is an honest and fair reaction to what Revelation was, what you just described. As a fan who understands the lore and has kind of enjoyed diving into that for most of my life, I know that I'm guilty of being a person who has opinions. And so when things come up, I will argue, no, this is why Revelation is consistent, and this is why Revelation is good, because I understand this thing. But I think the more fair and honest way to approach this, and especially moving forward as we have Revolution now, and the reaction to it is happier.
Definitely.
Than things were with Revelation.
Look, I'll be completely candid with you. We were doing some press stuff for the show at Mattel a couple weeks ago now, I guess. And Kevin and Teddy and Rob and I were all in the room together. And we were sort of going what are they going to get angry about? We're sitting there being we're all so proud of how this season turned out. But we were all really proud of how season 1 turned out. And there were criticisms some things that made sense, some things that were kind of unexpected. And we were sort of bracing ourselves for what's the pushback going to be that we aren't anticipating? And I do feel the response I've seen largely has been not just the people who liked the first season liking the way that this is building upon it, but a lot of the people who were on the fence or worse about Revelation, being you know what? Props that they sort of shifted this more into the realm of what I wanted. Now, I don't think you could have gotten here without doing Revelation.
Right.
You know, anything you like about this season, for better or worse, is built upon what was done in Revelation. I think there's now an established base where you can create this sort of new normal. But I've been very heartened by how positive the response has been so far, especially from people who were less than positive last time.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the responsibility to be a good fan, I guess, is to take people at face value when they say what they like, but also what they're disappointed with.
Totally.
And I think that's obviously, I think there's always going to be extreme reactions to anything that happens. And that's unfortunate, especially in the world we live in of internet access, right?
Yeah.
But I think the middle line is we can accept people and their opinions.
Yeah.
Even when we disagree with them, at face value. And I think that's the healthier way to be a fan, in my opinion. Yeah. And it's something that I've been guilty of not being that way.
I was going to say, I've certainly been guilty of this in the past. Mm-hmm. But what I constantly try to keep in mind is, like, the one thing you can disagree over the stuff, you can have your complaints, you can fight vehemently to explain why you think something is great or something is terrible. The one thing I kind of abhor and try to prevent myself from doing as well is projecting intent, right? Yes. And that is both in the case of assuming the people who made this were trying to do this for this reason.
Right.
Beyond just what they actually did. They were trying to make me mad, or they were trying to push this agenda, or whatever this is. And similarly, I feel just as guilty in the past and try to avoid from doing this myself, is projecting why is this person having this reaction to the thing?
Yeah.
And it's like, no, if someone is speaking maturely and intelligently, it's like, focus on the words they're saying, even if they disagree with it. They're telling you the content of what they're saying, rather than going, well, you're just saying this because you're blank, you're such a dyed-in-the-wool fan that you're going to like anything they do, or you're a hater, you were always going to hate this, mm-hmm. You're coming to this with your baggage, good or bad, which, all of us have some amount of, baggage of just who we are as people, what our tastes are, right? But I do think it's always better if you engage with, what I'm saying, the meat of what the thing is and what people are saying about the thing, rather than turning it into something
it doesn't need to be.
Yeah.
And I don't like this idea of fan gatekeeping and people accusing others of not being fans because they think something.
Right. And I've tried to be very I would never accuse someone who doesn't like the version of Motu that I'm a part of not being a real fan.
Right.
And even if I heard them explain the reasons why this doesn't work, I think this goes against the spirit of Motu, this breaks my internal canon. Even if I were to personally disagree with that, I would never say to that person, well, it sounds like you're a fake fan. Right. It sounds like your relationship to this is wrong, or you like the wrong version of this, or like it for the wrong reasons, right? Because it's just nature of when a thing exists for this long. People are gonna have different relationships to it. Like, and what I just sort of ask for in return is, like, if I'm not gonna say that to you, don't say that to others.
Right.
Yeah.
It just has such a sense of smugness about it, and I don't know, just dismissal. We
have all been guilty of this in the past.
Like, absolutely.
You care too much about a thing, as we all do. Whatever the thing is. And especially, the internet makes it really easy to just, like, turn these things into much larger arguments and make a lot of assumptions about people you're not actually talking to face to face. It's a lot harder to make those judgments when you're dealing with a person in a tangible way, in a real room.
We're much kinder when we're in the room with someone, right?
Or even a virtual conversation like this versus a screen name with an avatar, and you can just sort of type with impunity. Or even if you're not typing it out, what you're just telling yourself about them. It's like, I am, like, very proud of this show and my small part in it, but I also watch it, like, as a fan, and I read the scripts as a fan, and I'm like, this is cool. Not only am I part of Motu, but I'm part of what feels like the version of the show that I had always wanted to see, which I know is not everyone's version.
Sure.
And there will be more versions. And some of those I might like more than the one that I'm a part of. And some of them I will inevitably like less, you know? Right. And I don't feel, I already repeated this in I think the interview I did with Dad at Arms. So excuse me for giving you the leftover take here. But my analogy was, do you remember the feeling when Batman and Robin came out? A movie I've kind of come full circle to having a lot of fondness for it being sort of the last time Batman was allowed to be that goofy. But a movie that people really were unhappy with, and a movie that was like a bomb, right?
Yeah.
And the feeling at the time was, oh no, Batman is like dead now.
Yeah.
That was the last shot we had, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, you make one bad Batman movie, they're going to put this thing on ice. No pun intended.
I think it was intended.
They'll put it on the shelf, but there was this feeling of like, the stink is this is going to be so hard, so bad, and they're so reluctant. They so infrequently try to make these comic book movies in the first place that one bad one is going to kill off a franchise forever. And when Batman Begins came out 7 years later, whatever it was like, oh God, okay, come on.
Yeah, like let's do this.
But you can't mess this up. We're already
like
2 strikes against us, you know, or whatever.
Yeah.
We're like in the hole, and the relief you felt of like, oh, they got it right. At least we're going to get 2 more good movies out of this.
Mm-hmm. And I remember specifically walking out of Batman Begins with my now wife, but my girlfriend at the time, and just being like, I was so worried going into that after Batman and Robin, you know?
Yeah. Yes.
And this is the Batman I wanted to see.
And that was my feeling as well. I was like, this is the exact Batman movie I want to see. For other people, what the Batman movie they want to see is what Snyder got to later.
Right.
Or
and
what
now
Matt Reeves got to later.
Yeah.
Or their version was Adam West earlier. Or their version is the one that hasn't happened yet, you know? But the thing that happens is like, we are really spoiled now. Where like, I live in no fear of ever running out of versions of Batman, right?
Right.
I'm just like, we're going to get so many Batmans, more Batmans than we know what to do with for the rest of time. And we basically have multiple Batmans running simultaneously now, you know?
Yeah.
We just had a movie that had 2 different versions of Batman in it. We have the Robert Pattinson version continuing, and we have Snyder developing, or not Snyder, I'm sorry, the new James Gunn version.
Yeah.
Developed as well. And all these things are going to live simultaneously. We have like 3 different live action Jokers, you know? I mean, like all this stuff, I think you need to sort of see the blessing of there is a gift in the lack of preciousness we need to feel over these things. Not that we need to care about them less.
Right.
But that the stakes are so much lower in the grand scheme of things for any version of these characters we see, because it's never going to be the final definitive one. Whether it's good and successful, that's not going to lock it into, well, now all versions have to be this. Or if it's bad and unsuccessful, they go, well, they'll just try it again in a different way, you know? And I think that's sort of the joy of modern fandom, which is a complicated thing, but I think that's the real gift we should look at, is just sort of like, you can just engage with whatever you want the way you want to. And I used to get so angry when there was a version of a thing I grew up loving that I did not like, because that's what the stakes felt like for me. And I was the guy who was going online and ranting about this stuff, you know, and like screaming at my friends in the corner of bars until they were like, chill out, dude. I don't want to hear you complain about this anymore. But now it's like, I can see a thing, watch a thing, read a thing, and not like it. And I don't feel like you blew it for the rest of us, you know?
It's a wonderful thing to grow up, isn't it?
It is.
And to be a little bit more mature about these things.
It takes time.
It does. And we all look back and be like, man, I was an asshole back then about these things.
Yeah. And like kind of a dummy about it. Yeah. And it's, you know, I will see things that I hate, and I will rant about them in a very quiet, controlled way.
Yes.
You know, I will like find my outlets to, in a healthy way, process my, I'm not saying you can't do it publicly, but it's just, you know.
Right. unfortunately unfortunately for my lovely wife, she gets to be the sounding board when I am displeased with things.
Yes.
But that's what love is.
Yes. That's a beautiful way to put it.
Well, we've almost been going for 2 hours here.
Yeah.
And this has been fantastic. I want to make sure that we spend a little time and talk about some toys, because that's what Motu is all about, right?
Yeah. I was messaging you. I was running late because I got too many of the sort of Target tote bag that they give you, and I couldn't figure out in my apartment which of the same identical bag I had left this guy in.
He's so good.
So good.
He's a lot of fun.
Look, I'll be honest. I was very thrilled to get the first Masterverse one, the sort of weakened, sad Orko. But not just is this a cooler design, just even just going from the animation. This is like such a good figure.
It's a good figure.
It's a good figure. I mean, part of like him having sleeves now is you get extra articulation points you couldn't get the first one. From just a toy engineering point. But also my biggest complaint of the first Masterverse figure, and I was not going to complain too loudly because I was just like, look, I've waited my entire life to get an action figure of a character I play. I have to be grateful. But I was like, you're really not going to give him any sort of spell casting effects. You're not going to give him any blasts. With a character where it is hard to articulate him just because of his innate design, you're already limited in posing that you need, and especially because he gets to do such cool visual stuff in this new series. I'm like, give me that sort of thing, the sort of ring of energy he's conjuring up in that Scare Glow battle. I ended up ordering a third party one off of Etsy.
Sure, we all do.
Right, we all do. But like, this is just
it's great.
They went all out in a way I really appreciate. Yeah,
they did.
And I even just like, sort of the customization options of, you have the sort of clip here where you can remove the spiral if you just want him here. This ring rotates in sort of all these ways. Right, and then these are removable. So you really have the sort of modular. I know this is now sounding like a commercial, but I am just so thoroughly pleased with this thing. Nerding out all the time.
He's really great. And how fantastic, you just said it, but you get a toy of a character you played. I mean, that's I can't imagine the joy you must feel about that.
When we were doing the tick for Amazon, they sent me a photo. Like there was a sculpt of a figure of me that they sent for like likeness approval. That sort of thing you hear about where the actor comes back and goes like, the nose is too big, make it more like this or whatever it is. And I didn't give them any notes because I was just like, I just want this to exist. I don't want to slow down the process at all. And then like it got weirdly dramatic where the company crumbled and there was sort of like financial misdealings from the toy manufacturer. And like the thing never happened. And it was so frustrating to just have this photo on my phone. I would like show friends and be like, and I don't get it. I never get it. It never happens, And it just kept on being like, they made a Funko Pop of the Tick from our version of the show, but they never got to Arthur or any of the supporting cast. And they kept on saying they were going to do it, but it never happened. It kept getting so close. And then when I finally got this part, I was like, look, this is... If Mattel doesn't take the opportunity to make an Orko figure, then I just give up. Then I'm like,
if it can't happen now, it's never going to happen.
Exactly. So to have two of them now, and I was happy with the first one, but this one is really kind of like the thing of my dreams. And I do just kind of gawk at it. Like whenever I have it in front of me, I can't put it down. And it's funny because like, unlike if there had been a sort of Arthur toy at the time, that was a live action show, would have had my face. But like, I look at this thing and I feel the same kind of almost like weird pride as if I'm like looking at myself of like, that's me. Even though it's like, no, the part of it I do isn't represented by this toy. He doesn't have a sound chip. This is just what like Powerhouse does. This is what the animators do. But I'm still like, that's my guy.
Yeah. So now what you need to do is you just need to fully embody that character, replace all of your family portraits of yourself with Orko.
Yeah.
and just become Orko, do the single white female thing.
Yeah, that's what I got to do. I got to get sort of cosmetic surgery to look more like him. I got to wear more scarves over my face.
Yeah, bring back your big hat and scarves look.
Exactly. Yeah. No, but it's so cool. I also just, as a collector, I'm sure you will relate to this, but there's always the challenge of how do you depict Orko, right? Because he's a guy who's always floating, do you just make him a little guy who just sits on the ground, which doesn't really represent the toy properly if he's spinning around or on wheels or whatever it is,
right.
The vintage figure. And then so often when they try to give him these flight stands, I know this is a thing many people have called out on the internet, when they're poorly designed, they tend to look like he's farting.
Yeah. Or when they have a odd choice of coloring to them, it looks like they're urinating sometimes.
Yes. I'm like, this one, I think they really nailed. It does not feel like he is excreting anything. And it's made all the better by this this doohickey. But I just really feel like they nailed all of this. Mattel will be very kind and generous in certain cases with certain products, but I still end up spending so much more money on Motu merchandise out of my own pockets than I'd like to admit publicly. But this was one where they promised that they would give me one early, and I had to go to the Mattel offices. They sort of used it as bait to
hey, come
here and do some press. We'll give you the toy. But I've been waiting so long. I saw the prototype like a while ago, even before they showed it at San Diego Comic-Con. They showed me the prototype. I had to sit on that for a long time. Like, God, I know this is coming and I can't hold it in my hand. And I went to the Mattel offices, I guess, like early last year. And I'm like sitting there and I can't hold it. Like I can't touch it. It's too delicate. But it's like right there in front of me on the desk. And I was like, how long until you make this? And then, I've just been waiting to have the real version of it, which rules. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And I want to personally thank you for what you and Ted did for me with signing the package.
Well,
that was such a treat.
I told you I'm a fan of your videos and I've watched your channel before, and you had messaged me and thrown out the idea of trying to do something together when the new season came out. Or rather, you threw out the idea of trying to do a video together. And I was waiting until the new season came out so that there was new stuff to talk about. But Teddy asked me to sign that, not knowing that we had messaged. And I didn't realize that was your real name. And it wasn't until later when I said to Teddy, hey, it's cool if I go on and do a Dad at Arms Street. He went, yeah, that's the guy you signed the figure for. So very, very happy that came full circle.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I need to find space on my shelf. My shelves are overloaded with stuff. That's the thing. We always have to rearrange, right?
I know. I finally I live in New York City, so I'm limited by apartment space, which is much different than house space, or even the amount of space you get in apartments in most other cities.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And I think like a lot of people in the pandemic, my collecting kind of got out of control. You're stuck at home with less to do. You start to live on day. And I always had a good, healthy Motu collection across. It's really 2000X and classics for me, but are the two that I've not been completist on, but have the vast majority of both lines. And as a collector, you got to find your ways to set your limits. If I collect this, but not this, or whatever it is,
right?
And then I got cast in the role in. Halloween 2019 was the day I got the email, "You're Orko," which was awesome. And I started recording the part, I want to say January or February 2020. And then like a month later, the world grounds to a halt. And it became very easy for me to go, cool, my new project is scouring the internet for every single piece of Orko merchandise I can find. Now there is a new shape to my collection. Now I need every Orko, and not just every Orko figure, but every piece of Orko related paraphernalia. What is every medium that Orko has been represented in, right? So it's like, well, I have the classics and I have the the 2000X version, but now I have to track down the variants I maybe didn't have before, and the international versions of it. And I want packaged and loose, where I'm usually just a loose guy. I'm like, well, for Orko, I need to have, that has to be part of the menagerie of having the representation of the packaging. And then you get into the weeds of like, okay, so this Spanish company made a series of rubber stamps. You know, like, can I get a picture of the cross sell on the back of the stamp? Because I'm seeing on eBay there's a Man-at-Arms stamp. Did they also make Orko? You know, I try to limit myself to like, if it's merch where it's like, oh, there's like a cereal bowl that has 5 characters and Orko's one of them. I'm like, that's outside of the limits of my collection. But if there's an Orko specific cereal bowl, then that's the thing I now need to get. And part of the hunt is trying to figure out what exists out there. You know, they're like, He-Man.org had a database that was like very helpful, but some of the stuff you're like, is this a rumor that this exists? Was this ever, did it go into production, or are the photos only from prototypes? And how many are out there? And all of that. All of this to say, the big picture of it is I became, for the first time in my life, a guy who had a storage locker because the collection got too big, and I moved apartments, and I was just like, well, I don't want to get rid of stuff, but I can no longer, you know, like I did in 2020 and 2021, just have an entire corner of my apartment, a fourth of my apartment that is just Orko. I don't want to get rid of any of this, but maybe I'm streamlining what is on the main display for the hopes that someday I win the lottery and have a palatial estate where I can have an entire Orko room or Motu room. Yes. But yeah, no, it's a constant game of how do you reorganize the collection and reframe and reprioritize and all of that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Griffin, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, truly.
It's been a treat to meet you. Thank you for letting my son meet you. That was very kind, very generous. And
my pleasure, truly. Yeah, it's the coolest part of the job.
Awesome.
Well, the toys may be the coolest part of the job.
Yeah, the toys are the coolest.
Yeah.
You heard it here. Toys are cooler than kids.
I would agree. Yeah, that's my sentiment. You're not misquoting me at all. No, thank you so much for asking me to do this and for all the work you do. As I said, I've been a fan for a while. Been watching your stuff silently for a while. Yeah,
I appreciate that, and that's awesome. That's very flattering. So thank you.
Yeah.
Before we go, would you like to kind of plug yourself and kind of tell people where they can find you?
Sure. I'd say the hottest action figure release of 2024 is the Orko Gwildor 2-pack, I think available at all specialty retailers and online stores. I see no cut of the profits. I'm not selling this in order to get rich. I just think everyone should own it. And then, all 5 episodes of Motu Revolution streaming now alongside the 10 episodes of Revelation all together in one piece now. So if you haven't watched until this point, which I'd be surprised if someone watches your channel and has not watched the show at all, but I encourage you to watch it all. And if it's been a while since you watched Revelation, maybe give it another shot. And then I try to use social media less and less every day, but I am Griff Lightning, like Grease Lightning, but with the first half of my name on most of the platforms. And I host a podcast called Blank Check with Griffin and David that is about movies. And we're getting ready to we pick a director and then go through all of their films, one episode, one movie at a time. We're getting ready to do John McTiernan, the director of Die Hard and Predator, Hunt for Red October, who's like arguably the greatest action director of all time and had an incredible rise and fall arc. He fell about as hard as a guy can in multiple ways, but that's one of the things we find fascinating on the show, is not just talking about the movies, but talking about the career arcs of these people. And if you are a fan of the Motu series I'm a part of and of Kevin Smith, he has been on the show before. He's coming up on an upcoming episode that I won't spoil for people. So awesome. Tune into that.
Cool. Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everybody out there, for watching and continuing to tune in to listen to me talk about He-Man endlessly. You can follow me at Dotted Arms on Twitter and Instagram, where on Instagram I mainly post just photos I take of my toys. So yeah, and the occasional hot take where I say something stupid and people get mad at me for it. So that's
the poison chalice of remaining on social media. I always say it's like Russian roulette. You think I can just do this in a way that doesn't make anyone angry, and then every once in a while
someone's angry.
and you look back and you go, I guess there was a bullet in that chamber. I guess I forgot that the gun wasn't empty.
Absolutely.
That's on me. I shouldn't have posted that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, and we'll talk to you later.
Yep.